The first red flag didn't and oppose. T come in the mail or show up as a legal notice. It arrived in the form of a white Lexus SUV that smelled like expensive perfume and entitlement, pulling right onto the edge of my fresh foundation exactly 8 days after we broke ground. I was standing there with a lukewarm coffee in my hand, looking at the skeletal beginnings of what was supposed to be my sanctuary, a quiet, modern beachfront home on a lot I'd saved for since my first year as a structural surveyor, when Priscilla Thorne stepped out. She was wearing one of those wide-brimmed sun hats that looks like it has its own zip code and clutching a clipboard to her chest like it was the Ten Commandments, and before I could even say hello, she was already shaking her head. "You can and oppose. T do this," she told me, her voice hitting that perfect, practiced tone of, I oppose. Am speaking to a subordinate, and she pointed a manicured finger toward the dunes where a messy, foot-worn path cut through the sea oats. "That's a designated public access corridor for the Sandstone Cove community, and you're obstructing a 20-year-old neighborhood right-of-way that we, as the Homeowners Association, have a duty to protect." I just stared at her for a second, wiping a bit of drywall dust off my jeans because I'd spent 6 months doing due diligence on this land before I dropped a single cent on it. I told her as politely as I could that there was no easement on the deed, no recorded right-of-way with the county, and that I owned every square inch of that sand right down to the mean high-water mark, but she didn't even blink. She just gave me this thin, pitying smile and said that common usage trump my little piece of paper and that if I didn't oppose, to move my fence line back 30 feet, the HOA board would make sure this house never saw a roof. That was the moment I realized I wasn't oppose. Just building a home, I was inadvertently declaring war on a local monarchy that had been running this stretch of coast like a private fiefdom for decades. By the next morning, things went from annoying to aggressive, and I woke up to find that someone had used neon orange survey paint to spray a giant X across my fresh concrete and staked a handwritten sign in my lawn that read public beach access, do not block by order of HOA. It was so bold, so utterly delusional, that I almost laughed while I was pulling the stakes out of the ground. But the laughter died when I saw my construction foreman, Miller, looking at his phone with a worried expression. He told me 3 different, concerned citizens, had stopped by before 7 a.m. to tell the crew they were trespassing and that if they didn't oppose stop work, their licenses would be reported to the state board for, environmental negligence, Priscilla wasn't oppose. Just coming for me. She was trying to starve the project by spooking my labor, and I knew right then that I couldn't oppose. Just playing nice and hope they oppose. Go away. I spent that evening digging into the Sandstone Cove HOA, and what I found was a classic case of small-town power tripping fueled by a very specific kind of desperation. See, the actual community beach access, the legal one, had been destroyed in a tropical storm 3 years ago, and because the HOA had mismanaged their insurance funds, they didn't oppose have the $500,000 needed to rebuild the boardwalk. So, instead of being honest with the residents, Priscilla and her inner circle decided it was cheaper to just hijack my lot and pretend it was a historical public path, effectively stealing my land to cover up their own financial incompetence. They'd done it before, too, harassing an elderly couple a few plots over until they sold their land at a loss, just to get away from the constant fines and fake violations. The board kept dreaming up. The first real shot across the bow was cease and desist, letter printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock that looked more like a wedding invitation than a legal threat, signed by a law firm that I later found out was owned by Priscilla's brother-in-law. It claimed I was in violation of prescriptive easement, and threatened a lawsuit that wouldn't, bankrupt my lineage, if I didn't oppose. Stopped construction immediately to allow for a community survey. I took that letter to my guy, a shark named Elias who specializes in coastal property law, and he actually chuckled when he read it. He told me they were fishing, trying to see if I'd fold under the pressure of big words and fancy letterhead. Because a prescriptive easement requires open, hostile, and continuous use for a statutory period without the owner's objection. And since this lot had been vacant, and owned by the state for most of that time, their claim was legally about as solid as a sandcastle at high tide. But Priscilla didn't and oppose. T cared about the law, she cared about optics, and making my life a living hell. So she moved the battle to the dirt. That Friday, I caught two teenagers on my security feed, one of whom I recognized from a photo on the HOAs and quote. Meet the board and quote. Page is the son of the treasurer, a guy named Vance, creeping onto the site at 2 o'clock in the morning. They wearing and oppos, T just tagging the walls. They were pouring sugar into the gas tanks of our excavators and tipping over the chemical toilets, so the waste leaked right toward the dunes. When I showed the footage to the local sheriff, a guy who looked like he'd seen too many seasons of coastal drama, he sighed and told me he'd file a report, but that, end quote. These HOA disputes get messy, end quote, and it was usually better to just, end quote, find a compromise, end quote. I looked him dead in the eye and told him the only compromise I was interested in was watching the people who did this walk away in handcuffs. Because you don and oppos, T mess with a man in oppos, S livelihood and call it a, end quote. Neighborhood disagreement, end quote. Then came the, end quote, environmental sting, end quote. I arrived at the site on Tuesday to find a van from the County Environmental Protection Department parked out front and an inspector named Greg looking very official and very annoyed. He told me they'd received, end quote, disturbing drone footage, end quote, showing that my crew had been clearing protected sea oats and burying construction debris in the dunes, which is a massive felony-level violation in our state. He showed me the photos, and my heart dropped for a second because they actually looked convincing until I realized the perspective was all wrong. I'm a surveyor, I know how to read a site, and those photos have been digitally altered to make it look like our silt fences were 30 feet further back than they actually were. I walked Greg over to the actual fence, pulled out my own calibrated GPS equipment, and showed him exactly where the property line was and how we had an oppos. T touched a single blade of protected grass. Greg's face went from annoyed to stone-cold silent as he realized he'd been used as a weapon in a personal vendetta, and he told me, off the record, that the email with the, end quote, evidence, end quote, had come from a burner account but was traced back to an IP address at the Sandstone Cove Clubhouse. That was the turning point for me, the moment where I stopped being the victim and started being the predator, because if they were going to use the county as a bludgeon, I was going to turn that bludgeon around. I started by hosting a, end quote, low country boil, end quote, on the edge of my property and invited every neighbor who was and oppos, T on the HOA board. The people who actually lived there paid the dues and were tired of Priscilla's high-heeled tyranny. Over beer and shrimp, the stories started pouring out. One woman, Sarah, told me how the board had fined her $500 for the, end quote, wrong shade of white, end quote, on her mailbox while Priscilla was secretly using HOA contractors to renovate her own kitchen. Another guy, a retired accountant, told me he'd been asking to see the HOA's books for 2 years and kept getting told they were, end quote, undergoing a confidential audit, end quote. Armed with this, I didn't an oppos. T go back to the HOA board. I went to the state attorney's office and the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. While Elias was filing a massive $2.5 million defamation and tortious interference suit against the individual board members, I was handing over folders of evidence showing how they were weaponizing state agencies and using HOA funds to fight a private legal battle. But the real, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, happened about a week later. We'd kept our own drones in the air 24/7, and we caught something that made my skin crawl. Priscilla and Vance, the treasurer, were meeting in the middle of the night on my lot, not to look at the, end quote, access path, end quote, but to bury a series of rusted metal drums they'd hauled in on a trailer. They were trying to frame me for a hazardous waste spill to get the EPA to seize the land and halt the project forever. I didn't an oppos. T called the sheriff this time. I called the Department of Environmental Quality and the state police. We let them finish burying the drums, and about 2 hours later, while they were probably at home sipping wine and celebrating their, end quote, victory, end quote, the siren started. They didn't end oppos. T just find the drums, which, ironically, were filled with old pool chemicals from the HOA's own maintenance shed. They found the trail of paperwork that led straight back to the board's mismanagement of the community funds. When the state police raided the Sandstone Cove clubhouse, they didn't end oppos. T just find my, case file, They found a second set of ledgers. It turned out Priscilla and Vance hadn't end oppos. T just been, mismanaging, the insurance money for the beach boardwalk. They'd been siphoning it off into a shell company for, consulting fees, to the tune of nearly $400,000 over 5 years. The fallout was like watching a slow-motion car crash in high definition. Priscilla Thorne was led out of her $2 million beachfront mansion in zip ties. Her famous son had nowhere to be seen, charged with felony embezzlement, conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, and filing false police reports. Vance followed her an hour later, looking like he was about to vomit as the news cameras caught every second of his walk of shame. The HOA, facing a mountain of lawsuits from both me and the defrauded homeowners, was forced into a court-ordered receivership. The public access path, they'd fought so hard to steal? It was officially declared non-existent by a judge who took about 5 minutes to look at my deed and another 5 to tell the HOA's replacement lawyers that they were lucky he didn't end oppos. T hold them in contempt just for standing in his courtroom. Construction on my house didn't end oppos. T just resume. It became a community project. The neighbors they'd bullied for years started showing up with coffee and donuts for Miller and the crew. And the hostile outsider, narrative Priscilla tried to build evaporated overnight. I ended up settling the civil suit for a high 6-figure sum, money that came directly from the personal assets of the board members because their official capacity, protection didn't end oppos. T count when they were committing felonies. I used a chunk of that money to fund a proper, legal, and environmentally sound beach access boardwalk 2 blocks down, on land the county actually owned, just to prove that I wasn't in oppos. T the greedy developer, they try to paint me as. Now, as I sit on my finished deck, watching the moon reflect off the Atlantic, I can still see the spot where that orange, X, used to be. The sand has shifted, the sea oats have grown back over the fake path, and the silence is finally real. But it makes you wonder, doesn't end oppos? T it? How many people have lost their dreams because they didn't end oppos? T have the resources or the stubbornness to fight back against a, neighborhood board, that decided it was above the law. We like to think our homes are our castles, but sometimes the people outside the gates are more dangerous than any storm coming off the ocean. I won my battle, and I've buried them with the very truth they try to hide, but the scars on this land and the community take a lot longer to heal than it takes for concrete to dry. So I've got to ask you, if you found out your local HOA was using your dues to fund a personal vendetta against a neighbor, or worse, covering up a massive fraud right under your nose, would you speak up and risk being the next target, or would you just keep your head down and hope they never look at your lot? Because after what I went through, I realized that, minding your own business, is exactly how people like Priscilla Thorne get their power in the first place. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to take a stand against an HOA that went off the rails, or if you think I went too far in bringing the whole board down. I'll be reading the replies from the safety of my own, very private, beachfront porch.